In the spring of 1943, an American banker boarded a train that carried him straight into the heart of Nazi Germany. The Second World War was at its bloodiest. American soldiers were dying in North Africa. German submarines were sinking Allied ships across the Atlantic. And yet this man traveled through Hitler's Reich without a weapon, without a uniform, without any of the danger that would have killed an ordinary American on sight. He sat down with officials of the Nazi Central Bank in Berlin. He talked business, and then he traveled calmly back to neutral Switzerland. His name was Thomas McKittrick, and he was an American citizen serving as president of an international bank while his country was at war with the very government he was doing business with. That sentence should stop you cold. And here is the thing. It is not a rumor. It is not a fever dream cooked up on the internet. The men, the banks, the shipments of gold I am going to walk you through are documented in declassified United States Treasury files, in congressional hearings, in wartime intelligence reports now sitting in national archives, and in the record of the Nuremberg trials themselves. What most history classes leave out, what gets compressed into a single tidy story of good versus evil, is the uncomfortable reality that some of the most respected names in Western business helped build the economic engine of Hitler's war machine, kept the money moving even after Americans were dying to stop that machine, and then walked away without handcuffs, without shame, and in many cases, richer than before. Let me show you how, but before I do, I have to be honest with you about something, because this exact story gets hijacked all the time. There is a poisonous version of this history, an old lie, that says a secret cabal of Jewish bankers pulled the strings of the 20th century from behind a curtain. I want to be completely clear. That is a lie, and it is the opposite of what the documents actually show. The real, documented story of who financed and supplied Nazi Germany from the outside points overwhelmingly at the American industrial establishment, at Protestant Wall Street dynasties, at oil companies and car companies and blue blood investment banks. The irony is brutal. The conspiracy theory gets the villains exactly backwards. So keep that in mind as we go. This is not a story about a shadowy ethnic conspiracy. It is a story about respectable, powerful institutions choosing profit over principle, in the open, in the record, and then being protected afterward by governments that found the truth inconvenient. To understand how it happened, you have to go back to the wreckage that Hitler inherited. After the First World War, Germany was a broken country. The peace treaty of 1919 loaded it with enormous reparation payments. Debts meant less as justice than as punishment. The German economy shattered. And then came the hyperinflation of 1923, one of the strangest economic collapses in modern history. Prices doubled and doubled again, sometimes within a single day. Money became so worthless that people papered their walls with banknotes or burned them in the stove because it was cheaper than buying firewood. Workers were paid twice a day and rushed to spend their wages before the numbers on the bills lost all meaning. The savings of an entire middle class evaporated, and into that ruined, humiliated, furious society. Extremism poured like water into a broken vessel. That is the soil the Nazi movement grew in. Now here is the part that rarely makes the textbooks. While Germany was flat on its back, a set of American and British financiers looked at it and did not see a humanitarian catastrophe. They saw an opportunity. Wall Street in the 1920s was booming, awash in capital, hungry for returns, and Germany was the perfect target, a nation with world-class engineers, disciplined industry, and a desperate hunger for foreign money. The logic was simple, and, from a banker's chair, elegant, you lend a broken nation vast sums. You help rebuild its factories. You collect interest the whole way. And you gain influence over the very industries that will drive Europe's next chapter, whatever shape that chapter takes. The machine that made this possible was a financial arrangement introduced in 1924, named after the American banker who chaired the committee behind it, Charles Doss, a man who would later become Vice President of the United States. The plan restructured Germany's reparations and, more importantly, opened the door for American capital to flood into the country. And the money moved in a beautiful circle. Beautiful if you were the one collecting fees at each turn. American loans flowed into Germany. Germany used that money to rebuild and to pay reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France used those reparation payments to repay their own war debts to the United States. Round and round it went, and at every stop, bankers skimmed their interest and commissions. Over the second half of the 1920s, billions poured into German industry, and a large share of it came from American lenders. The dominant force was the House of Morgan, J.P. Morgan and Company, which organized the bond offerings and sat at the center of nearly every major flow of capital between New York and Berlin. But Morgan was not alone. Other great banking houses and industrial interests took part too. By the early 1930s, key sectors of German industry and some of its largest banks were deeply entangled with American finance. This was not an accident of the market. It was engineered, deliberately, and it set the stage for everything that came after. Now let us meet the man who became the human bridge between Wall Street and the Nazi regime. His name was Hjalmar Schacht, and here is a detail almost too strange to invent. His full given name included Horace Greeley, after a famous American newspaper editor, because his family had spent years living in the United States and admired American life. Schacht had roots reaching into New York and connections to the world of American banking. He was brilliant, arrogant, and utterly pragmatic. As currency commissioner in the early 1920s, he is widely credited with the maneuvers that finally strangled the hyperinflation and stabilized the German mark, which made him a national hero of sorts. He then became president of the German central bank, the Reichsbank. But Schacht's most consequential act was political, not economic. He became one of the influential figures among the industrialists and financiers who lobbied Germany's aging president to hand the office of Chancellor to Adolf Hitler. This is a point worth dwelling on. Hitler did not simply seize power in a violent coup. He was maneuvered into the chancellorship through a series of backroom deals in which conservative elites and business interests convinced themselves they could use him, control him, point him at their enemies, and keep him on a leash. They were catastrophically wrong. But the leash was real in their minds, and men like Schacht were among those holding it. In late January of 1933, Hitler became Chancellor, and almost immediately Schacht was returned to the presidency of the Reichsbank, where he would engineer the financial trickery that funded German rearmament in defiance of treaty limits. Now, I want to flag something honestly here, because the popular version of this story loves to add dramatic specifics. You will hear claims about secret meetings on precise dates, where foreign bankers supposedly signed off on funding the Nazi Party, and claims that a full $1 billion in fresh American loans flowed to Berlin the moment Hitler took power. Some of these vivid specifics come from a single controversial author and are not well supported by serious historians, so I am not going to sell them to you as hard fact. What is not in dispute, what the mainstream record firmly supports, is the larger and frankly more damning shape of it. Massive amounts of American and British capital rebuilt German heavy industry in the 1920s. That industry became the backbone of the war machine, and key Western companies kept doing business with and materially strengthening that machine well into the Nazi years, in some cases even after the shooting started. You do not need the shakier anecdotes. The solid ground is bad enough. So let me put you on that solid ground, starting with the single most important industrial entity in the Nazi state, a chemical conglomerate whose name became a byword for corporate evil. It produced synthetic fuel, synthetic rubber, explosives, and, most infamously, the poison gas used in the extermination camps. It grew into a colossus, and part of its rise was financed and enabled through Wall Street channels in the late 1920s. American investors bought into its American affiliate. American directors sat connected to its board. And after the war, the photographic evidence introduced at Nuremberg showed that this conglomerate had poured a large sum into the secret political fund that helped finance the Nazi seizure of power. Its top executives were later tried at Nuremberg for using slave labor and for their role in the machinery of mass murder. And yet the American financial figures who had helped build and profit from its earlier expansion were, as one historian dryly put it, quietly forgotten. But the most damning single corporate relationship of the entire story involves oil. The flagship of the Rockefeller Empire, the great American Oil Company, then known as Standard Oil of New Jersey, entered into a web of cartel agreements with that German chemical conglomerate. Through those agreements, the American company shared the technology for turning coal into synthetic gasoline. Now understand why that mattered. Germany had almost no oil of its own. A modern military runs on fuel, and without a way to manufacture fuel from the coal it did have, Germany simply could not have fought a long war. The process that solved that problem for the Nazi state was developed and refined in partnership with an American oil giant. Let that settle for a moment. The fuel that moved German tanks and planes across Europe existed in the form it did partly because of technology shared by an American corporation. And it went further. In the mid-1930s, a company jointly owned by that same oil giant and a major American car maker transferred to Germany the production technology for a critical fuel additive, the compound that makes high-octane aviation fuel possible, the kind of fuel that fighter planes and bombers need to reach full performance. This transfer went ahead over the explicit objections of the United States War Department, which could see plainly what it meant for German air power. A German industry insider later admitted, more or less openly, that without that additive the German air war would have been impossible, and that they had it only because the Americans had handed over the know-how shortly before the war. Read that again. A senior figure on the German side essentially said, "We could wage air war because an American company gave us the recipe." And while that oil company was handing Germany the chemistry of air superiority, it was doing something else back home that a United States senator would later describe as approaching treason. Through its cartel deals, the company had agreed to hold back the development of synthetic rubber in the United States to protect the arrangement with its German partners. So when war came, and America suddenly, desperately needed synthetic rubber for its own military, the country found itself dangerously behind, because a private corporation had, in effect, sat on the technology to keep a cartel happy. Congressional committees documented these arrangements in exhaustive detail. The future president, then a senator running investigations into the war effort, used blunt and furious language about it. The company paid some fines. No executive went to prison. Now let us talk about the banks, because the money was just as complicit as the oil. Chase National Bank, the crown jewel of the Rockefeller financial world, maintained a close and profitable relationship with Nazi Germany through the 1930s and into the war. In the years before America entered the fighting, Chase helped funnel large sums into German hands through a scheme built around special currency instruments. On paper, these were meant for Germans living abroad who wanted to send money home. In practice, they became a pipeline moving American dollars toward the Nazi Treasury, and the bank collected handsome commissions along the way. And here is the detail that turns the stomach. Some of the German currency feeding this operation had belonged to Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution, forced to abandon their money as they escaped. That abandoned wealth was being recycled through a New York bank into dollars useful to the regime that had driven them out. After the coordinated night of anti-Jewish violence across Germany and Austria in late 1938, when synagogues burned and Jewish businesses were smashed and thousands of Jewish men were hauled off to camps, Chase did not recoil. It kept doing business. When Germany occupied France in 1940, most American companies pulled out. Chase and Morgan kept branches open in occupied Paris. The head of Chase's Paris operation grew so cozy with the Nazi occupation authorities that he wrote back to his superiors in New York boasting, in effect, that the bank enjoyed special standing with top German officials and that deposits were pouring in. That letter was written in 1942, months after Pearl Harbor, months after the United States had formally gone to war with Germany. American boys were already dying in the fight, and a branch of a major American bank was bragging about how well it was getting along with the enemy occupation. And Chase did not merely tolerate the occupiers. In occupied France, it moved to freeze the accounts of Jewish customers, and by some accounts it acted to block Jewish funds even before the Nazi authorities formally demanded it, anticipating what its powerful clients would want. Germany's own largest commercial bank was woven even more tightly into the machinery of the Holocaust, helping finance the construction of industrial facilities at Auschwitz, with looted gold from victims serving as collateral in the background. Decades later, the bank's leadership would acknowledge a moral and ethical responsibility, but acknowledgement is not accountability. No executive from that era was ever held criminally responsible for those transactions. And all of these threads, the oil cartel, the bank accounts, the loans, the shared technology, ran through one central hub that most people have never heard of. In a plain building near the railway station in the Swiss city of Basel sat the Bank for International Settlements, a bank for central banks, created around 1930 by a consortium that included the central banks of Britain and Germany and American banking interests. Its stated job was to handle German reparation payments. Its real function was more remarkable. It was designed to be a permanent, discreet meeting place where the central bankers of the world could keep doing business with one another no matter what their governments were doing, and that included governments at war. Sit with the image. While millions of men killed one another across Europe and Asia, the financial officials of the warring nations could still gather in neutral Basel, settle accounts, and keep their relationships warm, as if the war were an unpleasant interruption to the real business of banking. During the war, the board of this bank included high Nazi officials. The president of the Reichsbank, later convicted of war crimes, sat on it. A director of that infamous chemical conglomerate, later tried for its use of slave labor, sat on it. The banker who had helped broker the deals easing Hitler into power sat on it, and a Reichsbank official who had personally overseen the processing of gold pried from the mouths of concentration camp victims, later convicted at Nuremberg, was also a director. And presiding over meetings that included these men, sitting at the head of that table, was the American, Thomas McKittrick. He traveled through Nazi-controlled Europe. He met with Reichsbank officials in Berlin. He socialized with leading figures of the regime. And when he came back to New York during the war, he was honored at a lavish dinner attended by dozens of the most powerful financiers and industrialists in America, the presidents of great banks, executives of the biggest corporations in the country. It may well have been the single largest gathering of America's war profiteers under one roof, raising their glasses to a man who spent the war doing business with the enemy. That bank in Basel accepted gold from the Reichsbank throughout the war. Later investigations established that much of that gold had been looted from the central banks of countries Germany had overrun, some of it melted down and re-stamped to disguise where it came from. The bank took a share of this tainted gold as ordinary interest payments, and the full scale of what passed through it was almost certainly larger than what could be traced. It served as the crucial go-between for deals between Nazi Germany and neutral nations, letting Germany buy the raw materials it needed for steel and pay for them with looted gold, with the Basel Bank smoothing the exchange. A Swedish central banker deeply involved in some of these dealings would, years later, rise to become one of the most respected figures in international diplomacy, his wartime role largely forgotten. And in one episode that still stuns historians, just months before the war began in earnest, after Germany seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, this bank helped transfer a large hoard of gold belonging to the Czechoslovak National Bank straight into German hands. The move was approved at the top of the Bank of England, whose governor signed off on it without even consulting his own government's treasury. When questioned about it later, he essentially argued that it would have been improper to let politics interfere with the ordinary business of the Basel Bank. In other words, the smooth functioning of international banking was placed above the sovereignty of a nation and the fate of the people about to be swallowed by the Reich. A few officials in Washington, especially at the Treasury, understood exactly what was happening and tried to stop it, describing the American at the head of the Basel Bank as a man doing business with the Germans, while American boys were fighting and dying against the Germans. At the great post-war financial conference where the shape of the modern economy was drawn up, the American delegation actually pushed a resolution to dissolve the Basel Bank. The central bankers who ran it were not about to lose their private club. They quietly killed the effort. The bank survived. It was never dissolved. It still operates today, from the same Swiss city, still beyond the easy reach of any one government. Now there is a strand of this story that reaches directly into American political dynasties, and I want to handle it carefully, because it too gets wildly exaggerated. There was a New York investment bank, founded in the 1920s, that served as a financial vehicle connected to a German steel and coal magnate, who was one of the earliest and most important bankrollers of the Nazi Party. This industrialist funded Hitler's rise so openly that he later published a book whose title translates plainly as "I Paid Hitler." Among the directors of that American bank was a man named Prescott Bush, the future United States Senator, father of one American president and grandfather of another. When a newspaper exposed the connection during the war, the United States government moved under its wartime laws and seized the assets of the bank as enemy property. Several related enterprises were seized as well. Here is where I have to be fair, because this is the point where the story is most often distorted into something it was not. No criminal charges were ever filed against Prescott Bush. There is no solid evidence that he was a committed Nazi sympathizer or that he personally directed money to Hitler out of ideological zeal. What the record shows is a well-connected American businessman serving as a director of a firm entangled with a Nazi financier, at a time when doing business with German industry was widespread and, until the law changed, legal. The assets were seized, the matter was quietly closed, and years later, after the war, the holdings were returned to their owners. Prescott Bush went on to the Senate. His son and grandson became presidents. The lesson is not that a secret Nazi ran the country. The lesson is milder and, in a way, more disturbing. Even direct financial entanglement with the enemy's backers produced, for a well-placed American, no lasting consequences at all. The machinery of accountability simply did not touch him, and that pattern, the pattern of no consequences, runs through the whole story. Consider the great American automakers. One American car company's German subsidiary was described in a post-war United States Army report as, in effect, an arsenal serving the Nazi war effort, with the knowledge of its American headquarters. The founder of that company was a notorious anti-Semite whose writings were admired by Hitler himself, who kept the man's portrait in his office and praised him by name. In the late 1930s, that industrialist accepted a high honor from the Nazi government. His German plants built military vehicles for the Wehrmacht and used forced labor, including concentration camp prisoners. The Nazis never had to seize the company's German property. It was already serving their purposes. A second American automaker's German subsidiary was the largest car maker in the country and retooled to supply the German military with trucks and armored vehicles and engine parts. Together, these two American-owned operations dominated the German car market at the outbreak of war. Both drew on forced and slave labor. And after the war, when the full picture emerged, neither parent company faced criminal prosecution anywhere. Worse, American companies whose German factories had been bombed by Allied planes later sought compensation from the United States government for that damage. Read that slowly. Companies whose plants had served the Nazi war machine billed American taxpayers for the destruction caused by American bombs. So, we arrive at the ending. And the ending is the most infuriating part, because the ending is mostly the absence of an ending. When the war closed, the Allies convened the tribunal at Nuremberg to hold the leaders of the Nazi state to account. Some were sentenced to death, some to prison, a few acquitted. And among those acquitted was Hitler's banker, the man who had engineered the financial architecture of German rearmament. who had helped maneuver Hitler into power, who had linked the Nazi state to the wider world of finance. The Soviet judge on the tribunal filed a furious dissent, arguing that this man's central role in preparing the machinery of aggressive war was fully proven and that acquitting him flatly contradicted the evidence. But the Western judges prevailed, and he walked out a free man. A German tribunal later handed him a labor sentence, which was then overturned on appeal. He lived comfortably into old age, resuming his career as a financial advisor, counseling governments around the world, dying peacefully in his 90s. And the American at the center of the Basel Bank, the man who spent the war doing business with Nazis and overseeing the flow of looted gold, landed softly at that same Rockefeller-connected New York bank Chase, installed as a vice president. Years later, he even hosted the convicted Reichsbank official who had processed victims' gold, inviting him to visit the United States as a personal guest. The American directors tied to that chemical conglomerate's affiliate were never prosecuted. The Wall Street houses that had rebuilt German industry faced no criminal reckoning. The oil giant paid its modest fines and moved on. The banks carried on, and the reason for all of this leniency was not mysterious. The Cold War had begun. The same German industrial capacity that had armed Hitler was now wanted to help contain the Soviet Union. The same men and firms who had done business with the Reich were now needed to rebuild Western Europe and to fight the new enemy. Accountability was quietly sacrificed to strategic convenience. As the journalist who did more than anyone to document this history put it, the government smothered the whole thing during the war and after. So what are we actually left with? Not a comic book tale of good against evil, and definitely not the ugly fairy tale about a secret ethnic conspiracy, which the real evidence demolishes. What we are left with is harder to look at, because it implicates respectable institutions and celebrated names. The deadliest war in human history, a war that killed something on the order of 70 to 85 million people, was, running underneath all its horror like a cold underground river, also an extraordinarily profitable enterprise for a set of financiers and industrialists who operated above borders and, when it counted, above accountability. These were not fringe figures. They sat on prestigious boards, they dined with presidents, they shaped the policies of nations, and when the rubble was cleared and the dead were buried, most of them slid right back into their places at the top, fortunes intact, reputations laundered as thoroughly as any stolen gold. Their part in the catastrophe shrunk to footnotes that few people would ever read. The successor to those great banks is now one of the largest financial institutions on earth. The successor companies of that broken-up oil empire dominate global energy to this day. That political family produced 2 presidents. Those famous names still adorn museums and universities and foundations. The system did not merely survive, it thrived, and that is the real lesson, the one worth carrying out of this. The point is not simply that some bad individuals did terrible things, because bad individuals always do terrible things. The point is structural. When the machinery of international finance operates beyond the reach of democratic accountability, when profit is allowed to outrank every other consideration, including human life on a mass scale, and when the architects of catastrophe face no consequences, then the catastrophe is not a glitch in the system. It is something the system permits. So look around at the world we live in now. Look at the opacity of the money that moves across borders in an instant. Look at the revolving door between finance and government. Look at the corporations that operate comfortably inside brutal regimes while draping themselves in the language of human rights. Look at the banks that pay enormous fines for laundering money and treat those fines as just a cost of doing business. The names have changed. The mechanisms have grown more sophisticated. The scale has multiplied beyond anything the men in Basel could have imagined. But the underlying architecture, the architecture that lets capital flow freely while accountability stalls at every checkpoint, was built by the very people who did business with the Third Reich, and it was never truly torn down. History does not repeat itself exactly. But it echoes. And once you have heard this particular echo, it is very hard to stop hearing it. If this story unsettled you, good, it should. And if it makes you want to dig past the tidy version of history you were handed, better still, because that is the whole point. This is one thread in a much larger web, the hidden financial machinery that has shaped our world in ways most people never see. If you want to keep pulling on that thread with me, subscribe and turn on notifications. Leave a like if you made it this far, and I will see you in the next one.